Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Dwight Eisenhower, and the focus is international crises, health scares, and re-election. The year is 1954, and the Cold War mentality have kind of hovered over the Eisenhower presidency throughout his tenure in office, trying to keep communism in check wherever it is, questions about nuclear weapons, who would use them and when, how much money to spend on defense. These were all issues as Ike was keeping his eye on hot spots around the world. Case in point, Formosa. Formosa, now we call Taiwan, is the island about 100 miles offshore from mainland China. Mao Tse-tung and his communists had sort of won control over mainland China and evicted Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists that the United States had long defended and been an ally toward. They're now basically residing on Formosa, and the Chinese wanted Formosa back, but Eisenhower made it pretty clear where the United States stood on this issue. He said any invasion of Formosa would have to run over the 7th Fleet, being the U.S. 7th Fleet. But it wasn't that quite so binary or simple, because in the Formosa Strait, that waterway in between the mainland and the island of Formosa, there were some island groups that were occupied and being defended by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, the Khmer and the Matsu and the Tachins, and these are much closer to mainland China. In fact, a couple of cases just a couple of miles away, and the Chinese communists wanted those back, and they wanted them now. And the question was, what would the United States do if the Chinese attacked those islands? Well, the Chinese communists were about to find out, because they in 1954 started bombarding those islands, perhaps as a pre-invasion activity, and that's sort of getting on the radar of Eisenhower, who actually didn't want to go this alone. He wanted a full, all of United States approach, and so he actually went to Congress for authority to deploy military assets. It was called the Formosa Resolution that Congress passed and Ike signed, gave him very broad authority as commander-in-chief to sort of use his own discretion in using the U.S. military in the area of the Formosa Strait. So that was kind of shot across the bow, number one. Number two was, people wanted to know, would you use nuclear weapons in this case? Well, Eisenhower was asked this at a press conference, and he said, in any combat where these things can be used on strictly military targets and for strictly military purposes, I see no reason why they shouldn't be used just exactly as you would use a bullet or anything else. Kind of shot across the bow, number two, sending shivers down the spine of folks in other parts of the world when he made that sort of that comment. But Ike also moving diplomatically in kind of a carrot and stick approach. He convinced Chiang to actually withdraw the nationalist troops from one of those island groups, which quickly went back into the hands of the Chinese communists. The other two, still in the hands of the nationalists, still a little bit unclear what Eisenhower would do if the Chinese communists actually invaded, and this had the desired effect. The bombardment eventually slowed and eventually stopped. This whole idea of Ike's new look defense program focusing on deterrence, the concept of massive retaliation, those threats alone were enough to calm these waters, at least for now, in the area of the Formosa Strait. Let's go back to Europe. White hot. The Cold War going, but it's white hot basically in Germany, kind of the center of the landscape when it came to the Cold War. You now have West Germany aligned with the West, the US, British, etc., where they are now rearming. In fact, they joined NATO, the defense alliance that the US and Canada had joined with 10 Western European nations. But now East Germany is also rearming, and they're aligned with the new Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Bloc's mutual defense pact with 6 nations plus the Soviets and now East Germany. So tensions are high. The Americans have 6 army divisions that are in Europe. Some nuclear weapons are also in Europe. Eisenhower had always been leery about summits for summit's sake. He would go to a summit, but he wanted it to be for a purpose. But here in 1955, the British basically helped convince him that we got to calm down these tensions a little bit. Maybe even talk about de-escalating things and getting rid of some of this elements of the arms race that are going on right now. So let's get together and talk. The British, the French, the Americans, and the Soviets. And in this case, Eisenhower agreed. And they got together in Geneva in July of 1955. But Eisenhower came with a proposal, a really radical proposal that he called his open skies, that basically shocked the group when he read the following. My proposal is to give each other a complete blueprint of our military establishments from one end of our countries to the other, to provide within our countries facilities for aerial photography to the other countries. This is kind of unheard of. These are things that you usually want to keep close hold as secrets, and now Ike's saying, well, let's be transparent. The thing he wanted to avoid was an inadvertent nuclear war where one side or the other thought something that was happening and they start to panic and they launch a nuclear weapon when really there wasn't anything going on at all. And this kind of transparency could at least maybe eliminate that threat and maybe also calm the tensions overall by having this kind of transparency. Well, the British and French thought this was a really grand idea. The Soviets, not so much. Nikita Khrushchev is slowly emerging as really the power, post-Stalin power in the Soviet Union. He's party secretary now. He is at this summit. He said, look, there's just not enough trust between us for this. You're going to hide stuff. We're going to hide stuff. It's not going to work. The Open Skies Initiative didn't go anywhere, but at least the United States people thought this was a great thing by Eisenhower on the world stage, trying to do something to enhance world peace. His approval rating, even though he didn't get his Open Skies proposal, his approval rating shot up to 79% after the summit in Geneva. Well, it's now summertime of 1955. It's hot and humid in Washington. Congress is on vacation, and so Ike took a vacation as well. He and Mamie went to Mamie's family in Denver, Colorado, stayed with the Dows, relaxing with painting and playing golf. On September the 23rd, he played 18 holes in the morning, had lunch at the club. 9 more holes were planned then for the afternoon, but after 8 holes, he was kind of feeling tired, wasn't feeling all that well. Went back to the Dowds' home. He had dinner, did some more painting to try to relax, and went to bed early. Well, 1:30 in the morning, Mamie, who is in the next bedroom next door to Ike's, heard some bit of a commotion, and she actually went into Ike's room, and he wasn't looking very good. He wasn't feeling well. He was complaining of indigestion. He asked for some milk of magnesia, which she got, but he wasn't really looking any better after an hour or so. So she called the physician, Howard Snyder, who had been Ike's doctor for several years, also a family friend. He's at the military base nearby. He comes over around 3 o'clock in the morning. He looks over Ike. He does his analysis. Basically, I think it is indigestion. Let's keep an eye on it. Well, several hours later, Ike is still not improving. It's early morning, mid-morning, midday the next day, and Snyder's getting worried, so we got to do some more tests. He ordered an electrocardiogram. Turns out that the President of the United States had had a heart attack and basically gone undiagnosed for several hours, but they now moved him to a hospital, and one of the things that Ike told his team is, look, get the word out, be transparent. He knew some of his predecessors had had some serious illnesses that they basically tried to hide. Grover Cleveland, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt. That wasn't going to happen on his watch. He told his team, tell the truth, the whole truth, don't conceal everything. Well, they did, and the country panicked a little bit. The stock market took a dive. People are worried about their hero now in the White House, and he's ill. Is he going to make it? Well, the government continued. The cabinet secretaries continued to run their agencies. Vice President Nixon would convene the cabinet and the National Security Council, being very careful to sit in his own chair, not in the president's chair. Sherman Adams, Ike's chief of staff, came out to Denver, very slowly starting to give him a little bit of work, major decisions that had to be made only. After a couple of weeks, Ike went for a photo op on the roof of the hospital. He was in a wheelchair, but he had his broad smile out there, trying to reassure the American public, reassure them that he's actually on the way to recovery, but he wasn't ready to get back to Washington, D.C. yet. He did not want to go into the White House in a wheelchair. He was going to wait till he could walk under his own power, and that finally occurred on Veterans Day, November the 11th, almost 2 months since his heart attack. He did go back to Washington, went to the White House, and then he and Mamie the next day went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Why Gettysburg? Well, that's where the Eisenhowers had bought their retirement home and some property that they had been renovating, this farmhouse to live in for the last several years, kind of a pet project of Mamie. It's basically ready to go. And they spent the next couple of months rehabilitating at the new home in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Ike is the real question everyone wants to know about all this is he going to run for re-election? What does the heart attack mean for an election that's now less than 1 year away? And of course, Ike hadn't decided yet. He's thinking about it. It's on his mind, the health concerns. He had an interesting comment to his friend Swede Haslett that he wrote in a letter about what his doctors told him on how to recover best from a heart attack. His doctor said that to avoid all situations that tend to bring about such reactions as irritation, frustration, anxiety, fear, and above all, anger. When doctors give me such instructions, I say to them, just what do you think the presidency is? Basically all of those things. He felt he was the right man for 4 more years as president of the United States, but was he going to be healthy enough for it? He wasn't sure yet. February of 1956, the doctors are reporting on his progress. They've been monitoring him carefully. They believe he is ready to return full-time to work, and they believe he is healthy enough to run again. Ike still wasn't so sure, and he did something he doesn't do very often. He asked Mamie for her opinion on one of his professional decisions, and in this case, she didn't want a part of it. Look, she said, this is your presidency, it's your health, this has to be your decision, but he eventually did make it there in February that he was going to run again. He felt he would be healthy enough, and he thought he was the right guy for the job. job. But the next question immediately from the press was, are you going to keep Richard Nixon as your vice presidential candidate? Because Nixon and Eisenhower never really got along well. Nixon was basically on the outside looking in throughout most of the first term. And so Ike gave an answer when he was asked this to the press that was pretty open-ended. He told the press, I've said that my admiration and my respect for Vice President Nixon is unbounded. He's been for me a loyal and dedicated associate and a successful one. I'm very fond of him. But I'm going to say no more about it. In other words, he didn't really answer the question, which left Nixon dangling in the wind for the next several weeks, as Ike was not going to weigh in on this. Eventually in April, Ike confided to a colleague, said, you know what, Nixon hasn't even asked me if he wants to be on the ticket yet or even offered anything, so why should I make a decision? Well, Nixon heard about that. He made a beeline for the Oval Office, said, sir, I'd love to be your vice president for 4 more years, and Ike said fine, and that issue was put to bed just in time for another health scare. Just a couple of months away from the Republican National Convention, Ike, who had often had a problem with his digestive system, was diagnosed with another very serious ileitis attack, and this time medicine wasn't going to do the trick. The doctor said, we need to go in with surgery, clear up these blockages, and Ike said, okay, he did that. 5 weeks of recovery, so again, sort of his second health scare in less than a year. He and Nixon then are nominated by the Republican National Convention, and it's a do-over against Democrat Adlai Stevenson, who was nominated by the Democrats. And Stevenson's attack line became pretty clear. Eisenhower is lazy, he's too old, he's not healthy enough, he doesn't work very hard. According to Stevenson, the chief executive has never had the inclination and now lacks the energy for full-time work. The president's age, his health, and the fact that he cannot succeed himself make it inevitable that the dominant figure in the Republican Party under a second Eisenhower term would be Richard Nixon, supposed to scare the electorate along those lines. And look, Ike just didn't really pay attention to this. In fact, he wasn't really going to campaign at all. He had done his job. He thought he had done it well. If the American people want him for 4 more years, that's fine. If not, he'll head to Gettysburg in retirement. But he had other things on his mind. In fact, yet another international crisis. In Egypt, in the Middle East, Gamal Nasser had been one of the leaders for the Egyptian Revolution in 1952, and now in 1956, he is the president of Egypt, and he is a pro-Arab nationalist. He wanted all those colonial powers, pretty much Britain and France, who had dominated the Middle East for so many decades and decades, he wanted them out, but he was also open to investment from East and West, the Americans or the Soviets. In particular, he had his eyes on building a dam on the southern part of the Nile, the Aswan High Dam, going to be one of the biggest dams in the world, and he courted the Americans to make an investment, and the Eisenhower administration said, okay, we'll support you in this. But then some red flags popped up. Nasser's government recognized formally the communist government in China, and then when the Americans, trying to stay neutral militarily in the Middle East, refused to sell weapons to the Egyptians, they bought $100 million of weapons ostensibly from the Soviets. It went through one of their satellites in Czechoslovakia, but it came from the communist side of Europe, and now the Americans are thinking this is not going in our direction, Nasser's not really on our side, and they withdrew their support for the Aswan Dam. Well, all this is going on, Nasser's feeling some pressure coming at him from both sides, and one thing he had in his control that he thought would really make a statement, he was going to nationalize the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal being that critical waterway in which all that Middle East oil, as other trade and transit went through that region. It all went through the Suez Canal. It was on Egyptian property. It was within Egypt's geographical boundaries, but the British actually were the major stockholder in the company that ran the Suez Canal, and Nasser said, I don't care. I'm taking it on. This is Egypt's property. We need to manage and run the canal. Well, the British said this isn't going to work. We've got stakeholder rights here. This should be an international event. And they went to the United States and said, look, remember when we did that coup together in Iran a couple of years ago? Maybe we should do something like that again in Egypt. Get Nasser out of there and really do this thing right, put somebody favorable to us in place, keep the communists out, and keep the Suez Canal open. And in this case, Eisenhower turned him down flat. To take sides could do nothing but to destroy our influence in leading toward a peaceful settlement of one of the most explosive situations in the world today. Eisenhower wanted to remain neutral, even though the British and French had certainly been the Americans' allies for many, many years, including in World War II. He wanted to remain neutral in this region as he embarked on what he called the most demanding 3 weeks of my entire presidency. He, in fact, even gave a warning to the British, don't invade militarily in this case. Well, what happened was on October the 29th, just a week before the U.S. voters went to the polls to vote for President of the United States, Israel invaded Egypt. They sent troops into the Sinai Peninsula. And immediately the British and the French jumped in diplomatically and said, look, this is not a good situation. Israel, you need to withdraw. But oh, by the way, if Israel withdraws, Egypt, you need to give up the Suez Canal and have it be internationalized again. Well, Israel said fine. Egypt said no, and it turned out the whole thing was kind of a ruse because the Israelis were in cahoots with the British and the French on this. And it was really a precursor, expecting the Egyptians to say no, for the British and the French to say, fine, you denied our outreach to you in this particular area. We're going to come in militarily and we're going to take the Suez Canal. And the very next day, that's what they did. 200 ships showed up at Port Said, which is the front end of the Suez Canal, including 5 aircraft carriers. Yeah, they were ready for this invasion. And when it happened, Eisenhower blew his top. He was angry and he told his Secretary of State, Foster, you tell them, God damn it, we're going to the United Nations. We're going to do everything there is to stop this thing. Nothing justifies double-crossing us. I don't care whether I'm reelected or not. We must make good on our word. Otherwise, we are a nation without honor. Not only was he not going to support this, he wanted it stopped, and he wanted it stopped right away. Well, the British and the French kind of ignored Eisenhower initially, and for a couple of days, they're pursuing their military operations to try to take the canal. Well, Eisenhower had one trick up his sleeve, and he decided to play it. The British had recently asked the Americans for a loan, $1.5 billion, because the pound, the British pound, was under pressure in parts of the world. And so Eisenhower went after that. He told the British Premier Anthony Eden, if you don't get out of Port Said tomorrow, I will cause a run on the pound and drive it down to zero. And that worked. Not only deterrence from a nuclear standpoint, the United States as a power had deterrence as an economic power as well. The British and the French stood down, got out. Soon after, the Israelis got out. The Egyptians would control the Suez Canal. They would do it on an international basis. But the tensions were almost immediately resolved because of the strong stand that Eisenhower took, again, going against his traditional allies, but based on what he believed was the right thing for that region and the world. All of this came to an end on November 6th of 1956, which happened to be Election Day in the United States, in which case Eisenhower had another landslide win. He easily beat Stevenson, adding 15 votes to his Electoral College vote from 4 years before, beating Stevenson 457 to 73. He added 1.5 million votes in the popular vote, and now had 57% of the popular vote. It's a pretty good day. November 6, 1956, Eisenhower ends an international crisis, and he's reelected in a landslide as President of the United States. That's a pretty good day for Dwight Eisenhower. And that's Dwight Eisenhower and international crises, health scares, and re-election. From the life of Dwight Eisenhower. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.